You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson. Hi, everybody.
And we're kind of virtual because everyone's shut in with the COVID-19. We're all in our homes and finding new ways to keep busy, communicate, reach out. A lot more people are experiencing and downloading more podcasts, which is awesome. So we have an actually interesting show we're doing today with Glenn Steckling, the director of the GEORGE Adamski Foundation. He's been on with us in the past, and we're just going to have an interesting chat. We have some questions lined up for him, so I think it'll be a good show. What do you think?
Oh, I think this is going to be great. We actually, this show is going to be a little bit different than some of the other shows that we've done with Glenn. Some of the other shows we've covered his past with Adamski. His father worked for George Adamski, and he grew up with Adamski and his sightings in his childhood. And we talked about some of that, and it was mainly about his past. But this one's going to actually be about the changing climate now and how he feels about the atmosphere with the UFO phenomenon and how he feels about how things are changing. So it's going to be a little different, although there's going to be references to Adamski as well.
Yep, of course. There's a lot of, I have a lot of curious things to ask about if things that are happening now in the field are correlating with things that George may have experienced or was told about in the past about the future. So I'll be curious to see what his answers are and find out what his experiences are as well.
I wonder if they foresaw what we're going through right now, as you mentioned, as far as this particular pandemic. I wonder if they saw this coming.
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, it's very topical, but it'd be an excellent question, I think, to ask. Because that's the kind of thing. I know. My ideas of a pandemic is your planet is basically choking. And whatever we're doing to it, it's bad enough where the planet's like, you know what, I need to get rid of some of these fleas off my back because I can't even move anymore. And I think that's our planet's way of saying, you know what, we need to get rid of some of these people. There's so much damage being done to me. This is how it's almost a natural reaction. I think that's what a pandemic probably is. Every time that comes out, it's like you see all these earth changes, weather changes, and I just think it's the planet that's kind of pushing back, saying no more. We're gonna, I'm gonna take a stand here.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of changes as far as health, medical technology, and climate, and it's changing everything, really. And they were talking about how the planet needs to be cleaned out. And they were also talking about, at the time, nuclear energy. They sensed that the atmosphere, that they were afraid that the nuclear energy that was being tested at the time was going to seep into the atmosphere. But I wonder if they saw more than that. And of course, if George Adamski was really in touch with those people, and Glenn mentions that he was, they were definitely more medically advanced than we were.
Yeah, it's
And
almost, I mean, just talking to Glenn before, he said that they didn't want to tell George everything, at least not at once. They kind of wanted to let him comprehend it in the best way that he could. That's kind of the impression I got from the books,
right.
too, that he was told things, but he wasn't told everything all at once. It was over a period of time, and it was ways that he could understand it.
Right, and there was also as far as the technology, I mean, on a different subject. There, I mean, the same subject but different. As far as the technology of the way they ran those ships, there were parts of the ship that he was allowed to visit, and parts of the ship he wasn't, because he wasn't allowed to see what they were doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, see,
So,
I wonder, it could just be that.
but I will ask him. I will ask Glenn about that, because Glenn might have heard something in his childhood that they said something about this, and maybe Glenn knows something about this, about the current atmosphere.
It's possible. I mean, any kind of changes they would understand probably better than we would on why. Although we know a certain amount, like our planet does go through, it's always evolving too. It's always changing, and that's why cultures and people come and go, animals come and go, and the environment changes, the landmass changes, the seas. So there's so much that we know, but there may be a lot more we don't know too.
And I'm very curious to see Glenn's answers. So I can't wait till he comes on, and we can ask him some very important questions, I think.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, so it's going to be exciting. So caller is George. Are you there?
Glenn's here.
Hey,
I mean, George.
George might be here. We don't know.
George might be.
Yeah,
Glenn, glad to have
me?
you on. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, it took a little while to get things hooked up. I tried to go through the PC, but the cell phone seems to be the best.
Yep.
Anyway, it's good to have you back on.
I'm glad to be back with you. It's lots of things going on, obviously, and I'm always happy to discuss this UFO situation.
Yeah, well, we have a lot to discuss about. So we have quite a few questions for you. I believe the first few shows we talked all about your past with GEORGE Adamski, and we talked all about your childhood, where you witnessed a lot of sightings and you witnessed a lot of events that are talked about in his books. And your father, of course, worked for Mr. Adamski. So the question that I have for you now, since you grew up with all of this, we have more technology now to record to record a lot of these sightings and a lot more events with these sightings. There were back in the 1950s when Adamski was doing this, there were a lot of stories, closer encounters than there are now, where they were meeting people and actually some of these occupants for the ships in person. And you can't say that all of them are fake, because some of them are pretty extraordinary. Why are there no stories like that now, when we have more technology and we could bear witness to this more now than we could have then?
Well, as far as the contacts that occurred during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, these are by far not the only ones. I mean, you look back in recorded history in all civilizations in ancient past, and they all have records of beings from the sky that came down to engage and help them, and then they went back to where they came from. But during the contactee phase after the Second World War, these crafts landed in many countries amongst the people, and also presented themselves to government officials as well, and interacted with the population. And there are two phases to the disinformation program, and one of them began during this time because there was no way to control the higher technology and the contact phase with our general population. That means our government and our military agencies could not prevent this from happening. And so in the late 50s, starting with their test program in 1961, they decided to see if they could use Psychology 101 on the people of this planet, on their own population, our government and military establishments, and to derive a program to discourage our general population from approaching their ships and their people when they landed. And this became the phase of the abductee situation, upon which it was used to scare the living daylights out of the general population, so that would discourage them from interacting with them, and also from procuring any of the messages or technology that they offered to help us with. And so that secondary phase went from the original phase of denial and cover-up to outright distortion, and thereby creating an environment that has been multiplied over time, not only through our official organizations, but unfortunately by the UFO community as well.
Do you think the
Well, it
McCarthy
sounds like
era
it.
and I was just thinking of the McCarthy era and the Cold War paranoia could have been used to their advantage for that during those periods? Like they could have, like, the impending threats, the impending doom, stay away, stay away. If they could have used that general public outcry or paranoia in general to use it for that very purpose, to keep people away from any kind of communication or contact.
Well, the reason that George went before all the government bodies, and he personally briefed Eisenhower and took him to one of our military bases in the California desert, in which one of these craft landed, and interacted with them. And since then, the UFO community has used the piecemeal of this information that has leaked out and distorted it into false accusations of a deal to allow them to harvest our DNA and all this other garbage. That had nothing to do with it. And that's unfortunate, because in this field, there are way too many unscrupulous marketeers that are willing to distort anything they can get their hands on in order to create enough of a sensationalistic story to get their name front page or on a film or what have you. And George also took John Kennedy out for the same thing, and he carried a White House pass that allowed him to go into the White House and brief the president on the situation. He went to Queen Juliana, he went to Pope John the 23rd, and also he was sponsored by Lord Mountbatten and Lord Dowden, the chief air minister in England, during his lecture tour there, along with Sir Desmond Leslie, who was the co-author of his book "Flying Saucers Have Landed."
Right.
Flying Saucers Have Landed inside. So George went directly to the leaders of the many countries, so they would have the exact information. And so, while there may have been an early McCarthy kind of scare, and actually McCarthy came in the later 50s. The necessity of having this information front and center, accurate information, and not the BS, was one of George's major functions. And so they knew by this time, by about 1962 and 63, they knew who was coming, where they were coming from, and how they looked like you and I, and how they interacted with us. And in fact, when my father went to NASA before 22 scientists in the 66, 67, right on the edge there, that was one of the major discussions. So we knew what was going on from the official standpoint. And the greatest resistance then came from the inner establishment that is combined to the military intelligence community and much deeper levels of our government than just the facade on top that you see that is Congress, which is really not a government at all. So when it was decided that they could not control the landings and the exposure to the information, then they turned to phase two, and it's worked quite successfully so far. We are willing to both the initial program and then the subsequent overlying one through the science fiction and the media establishment to scare the living daylights out of everybody. So everybody thinks that somebody's either going to come to eat them or use them or sexually abuse them or all this other nonsense that has absolutely nothing to do with the UFO field. This is just pure redirection.
Well,
it's almost
what
a
I did notice?
regurgitation of creativity.
You know what I did notice, though, about phase one, before they actually decided to go into the phase where they were trying to discourage people, is that they were they try to blend in with the atmosphere and the population. And they were actually quite succeeding, because George was the only one who knew who they were because they approached him. But if George didn't know who they were, nobody else would have thought about it.
No, that's an incorrect statement, Verna, because
why?
They approached many more people along with George. They have lady in South Africa, the twin sisters in Norway, the people.
I remember the twin sisters. Yeah.
This the Argentinian situation, Father Gill in Papua New Guinea. I mean, if you start to dig a little bit, you will find that this happened. This phenomena of interaction and visual sightings and close-up encounters happened all over the world in many different countries. And this was done as a support structure, because if one man comes forward and says something, the first thing he's ridiculed for the fact that where are the rest of them? And so that all over the planet, there was... Yeah, go ahead.
What about Giorgio Di Patanto? He claims he met Adamski's people. Adamski's... what was that encounter? Something you know about?
Well, I can't individualize and legitimize everybody's encounter, because obviously I wasn't there either. I know for a fact that there were a number of attempts to impersonate George. In fact, there were several times that George was in one part of the world talking and somebody else was impersonating him in a different place, saying totally contrary things. And at least at those particular ages, there was enough of a communications ability through telephone and telegraph in order to confirm that that wasn't him at all. And so, so there are some people that make claims that were incorrect, and there are some people that make claims that were correct. And so one has to look at
what do you think the intent was? Just to discredit, or just to take the limelight away from him and maybe get their own? What do you think the intention was for that?
The intention was to discredit and to redirect. So what happens is if at one point somebody says, well, I talked to George and he said this, this, and this, and this, which was totally opposite what was said before or published before or what have you, then, of course, it goes into a ridicule factor and discrediting. But George was able to prove he was not in those places, and the witnesses, of course, where he was always in public gatherings, and so there were many, many witnesses that could attest to the fact he was where he was when he said he was there. And so, you know, these were tactics that were used in the 50s along with the Men in Black to go and discourage people who reported sightings or contacts or threatened them. And George was threatened too. They threatened to tie him to the bumper of the car and drag him down the mountain. But he was not easily discouraged. And he said he called up the commanding officer in San Diego for the intelligence community. And he said, you know, I know who you guys are. I know your names. I know who you work for. And I'll just go to the papers and publish everything. And so they left him alone for the most part under that circumstance.
From what I read about him, he would have done it too.
He had no problems going forthright. He had experiences and he had a story to tell, and he never varied. And it was always on point, always the same one. He didn't embellish, and he didn't modify. He didn't modify anything in order to stay in the so-called limelight. And that's what happens today. People make so many claims, and the claims change. They claims change from week to week on whatever somebody else says. They go ahead and mime and copycat it because they want to be part of this so-called UFO community. And, you know, one has to be very vigilant and selective about what you say and what you do.
Well, what I noticed though is that the people who claim that they really did witness something or saw it end up being in the UFO community by default, but they don't want to be because it scared the bejeebers out of them unless they saw a faraway sighting. So,
Well,
so
well,
I mean, that's also another way to sift through somebody wanting the limelight.
well, I could. Unfortunately, there's a lot I know which I cannot say. But let us
Right.
let us at least say that there were some of what you call the so-called original contactees that that had one experience. I know one for a fact, and that person, when that ship landed and the female pilot came out, he turned around and ran for his life. And that was the end of the experiences for him. And so, some people had decided to, once again, the contactee field isn't free from their distractors any more than it is today. I mean, there were people who were willing to, have some decent exposure and to tell it as it was and not decide to go ahead and market or embellish it. And there are a number of people in that time that did just that as well. And so, you have that faction no matter what time frame you go through. But I think all in all, the message and the contact and the validity and the value of that still stands quite high and strong today. And I think people need to get over their fears. We are easily manipulated through fear in every aspect of our lives. Are we going to look at right now? Are we going to get sick? Are we not? Do we stay home? Do we not?
Right.
Are the decisions rebound upon us, and the insecurities remain constant when you are unsure of, your security in life and your standing and your income and your family's well-being. The whole world is on the edge of that insecurity, and it is very, very easily manipulated because of that, regardless of where this particular virus came from. And there are some truisms to it, and that is that it spreads like crazy, almost a 4-to-1 ratio. It races across the world. It decimates people's lives and causes many deaths. It destroys economies. And it creates an environment for the establishment of social obedience laws, one way or the other. So if you don't think that our own establishments aren't taking a very close look at the psychological impact of these sort of things and measuring the state of their own populations, then you better start thinking again.
Yeah.
Well, here's
exactly.
a question I have now that we're talking about this virus. Now, Adamski received a lot of messages from the occupants at the time. And of course, these people were technologically and medically advanced than we were. Were one of these messages talking about something in the atmosphere like this, or that was something that they chose not to tell, or did they not see it at the time, or they chose not to tell him? Do you know anything about that?
George made a statement shortly before he died. He said, "Your greatest fear should not be nuclear holocaust, but biological weapons and warfare." Because the uncontrolled expansion, irresponsible expansion of the world's population is rapidly approaching critical stages, and that produces all kinds of instabilities. And so biological release reduces population, in fact, and it can reduce certain species versus others, and it does not destroy the infrastructure. So I have to agree with him as time has gone on, and I've lived for the last more than half century, and I agree that type of usage or malusage of these type of experiments and is is a major concern. And you have to wonder, why in the world do we need to develop such strange to begin with? Even if it's developed in the laboratory, there can only be one use for it. So why develop it to begin with? What is the function of that, of anything that's progressive, obviously?
Well, if it was developed, I mean, I don't know the origin either, but...
Yeah, I still wonder about contagions anyway. If they design them, what's to say they aren't going to mutate and be turned around and be used back against the people that designed them?
Well, the issue with everything is containment. We are unable to contain any nuclear waste. And while the establishment, or in most part our government, had invested heavily during the Nixon time into nuclear power, they want their investment returned. And it still leaves that there is absolutely no containment process that has not leaked and will not leak. And so we have something that produces a byproduct that's already destructive to begin with. And radiation, my God, that's one of the major ones. And so our own fallibilities of how we do things sooner or later can lead to the release of such things. I mean, we all have seen the Andromeda strain. That's a pretty good message there.
Yeah,
what about the way the climate's changing?
The climate is changing, and that is a truism. Unfortunately, they use the term global warming, which is a misnomer, because it is not the entire planet that gets warmer. It gets warmer in its geographical reference. So geophysical change is the more accurate scientific term. And that means that areas that are cooler will get warmer, and vice versa, because you have a magnetic shift, you have a polar shift, you have ice melt, you have a whole situation where the planet goes through a, shall we call a realignment? That's a good word for it. And not only does the planet do that every 26,000 years, but the sun does that every 11,000 years. And should these two numerics align, which they do mathematically, that cannot be helped, then you have a larger situation and more and greater consequences. And we're going through that change right now. And so is this whole entire solar system. And so our greatest problem is that we do not care to pay any attention to nature's changes. So, for instance, we have people who live in a particular area, and I just watched a program about that, where the environment is changing and the water level's rising, and they offer to move the people to free and open and larger grounds and better prosperity. And half of them won't leave due to their traditions and their inbred thinking, and so consequently, we have a society that is totally disconnected from the natural changes. And if we were more connected, we could move ourselves to places which are much more comfortable, or will have less of a geophysical change. But we don't do that. We build cities on top of earthquake zones. Right?
Yep.
You're looking right up there in the Bay Area on an earthquake fault in which a nuclear power plant is even built on top of it. You look at Mexico City that sits on a huge volcanic crater or gas belt with 25 million people in it. I mean, you can go systematically around this entire world, and we do what we want, and we don't care about the circumstances until the circumstances occur. And then we scream bloody murder. Why me? Why me? Or why did God do this to me? God had nothing to do with it. You were the idiots who decided to do that.
And still.
Right? And so the planet is changing, and that was one of the major messages that was brought to George in 1952 to start that. And we did jump on the investigation. We had the solar year, which I think it was 1958, where we sent out a large array of scientific teams to both the Arctic and Antarctic, to both poles, and we established a very large beginning network of monitoring our own world. So through one channel or the other, it did occur, and it did motivate us to start doing something. The same thing with the space program. The push of these extraterrestrial visitors encouraged the Eisenhower administration to get on and do NASA. Of course, part of it was due to the space race with Sputnik in 57 with the satellites, but there's always tandem reasons for doing things. And at that time, of course, our military industrial program, as Eisenhower said, was a very large, shall we say, overseeing entity.
So they were the first ones to start Earth Day. No, I'm just kidding. but
Yeah.
Well, I think that started probably centuries beforehand. Yeah,
I know.
When you look at the Native American people who had contact and talked about the contacts and pictographs or exists all throughout the
they definitely
South,
were in tune with it.
Yeah, they were in tune with the environment and the changes, and that's why you see some civilizations that just upped and left. And we still, to this day, do not understand why these groups have suddenly abandoned cities and went entirely somewhere else. And it could very well be because they had enough enlightenment to see the reality and get a move on. Whereas now we are so arrogant in what we think we know, and we really don't know anything. I mean, that's terrible.
Well, the Native American culture makes no secret of these encounters with the people similar to who Adamski met, because they called them the Star People, and they mentioned that they came with a message for them to help Earth too. And these stories go back hundreds of years, so they don't make it. So they were aware of it long before.
Kind of adapted. The Native Americans adapted where they would move and shift for survival and food and shelter. So it's interesting that they already were kind of in tune to that idea anyway, which is live with the land, live off the land, but also understand the land in order to survive.
That's greatly correct, and that's it. They didn't sit around waiting for water that was never going to come. They got up and moved and went to the water, whereas these days we just sit in a drought and expect something to change for us. And you look at, and it's just not the Native Americans, and that's been for more than just several hundred years. There's probably at least 1,000 years that we can look back at, perhaps even longer. But the pedigree of the Tibetan kings, the same thing. The sayings, there are legends about Quetzalcoatl in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. And South Pacific people, everywhere comes down to the same thing. If you do not attune to the place that you live, then the consequences are going to get what you get, and it's not rocket science.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And every time there's a legend that I heard that every time they settled to a new place, they would do a little ritual to the spirits of that land to help them to thrive in it. I don't think anybody knows that anymore.
Well, no, but because we have the differences between monotheism and other religious thoughts and things, whatever. But to have reverence for, you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't make any difference what you call it.
Right.
That the intelligent force that guides all this is not random or chaotic, as the so-called atheists would love to believe. It's very uniform. It's very principled. You see it in one part of the world, and it's completely the same somewhere else. In fact, it's completely the same throughout the universe and cosmos and planets across the distant stars. These are principles that are the manifestation of creation, and they come about at specific times when the planetary systems have gotten to the point where it can sustain that. And so we have, once again, we are the knowers of practically nothing, and yet we love to theorize and hypothesize. And even worse than that, I recently read some kind of a statement that theory will become fact until proven otherwise. Now, I seem to recall that science was supposed to be the search for fact and not the establishment of theory in its place. And so we in our arrogance have put ourselves in this position. We put ourselves in this situation, and that doesn't mean that you have to go back and live in a cave and wear a loincloth and roll around in the dirt and mud. That doesn't what it means to be one with nature. No,
that's not the point.
It has to do with thought, and it has to do with action, and I think that a little bit more reverence for this intelligent force would do us a lot of good. In fact, that's what the space people live by. That is their religion, their so-called science of life.
I liked their thought process when I was reading about it. It's completely respect for the intelligence of creation and how it works with everybody and connects everything. Well, I wanted to ask you, since you're a pilot and you probably have seen a lot in your travels, is there anything that you've seen that you feel is worth mentioning, being a pilot and being able to witness the atmosphere over the years?
Well, I've seen a number of things. First of all, being introduced to these spaceships and their occupants and their pilots already from a very young age, having these sightings both with George and exposure with George, and then after he's passed away, the same people coming to my parents and our family over time. Our exposure in Washington and in Mexico and many other places makes it easy to identify these type of crafts and what is real and what is not. These electromagnetic propulsion ships or free energy ships that are using the waves of energy that go from one planet to the next to travel at as fast as twice the speed of sound. And there is no such thing as time travel, and it doesn't even apply to here. And we have found that we have subatomic particles that are also going faster than the speed of light, so that challenges all of some of Einstein's theories once again, because science is the constant revelation of fact and not theory. And so once you see these ships and you can identify them, and the propulsion is the main issue. They build the ship to match the propulsion, whereas we design aircraft first and then try to add a propulsion to it afterwards. So to make this simpler, when you have a lenticular or bell-shaped or cigar-shaped craft, you have the actual thing, because the energy flow has to pulse not only through the skin, but along the skin. And there are no peripherals, no appendages, no extensions, because any of that would immediately disintegrate or tear off the ship at such immense speeds and such a high amount of energy that fluctuates, literally travels along it. And so when you see things that are triangular shaped or got fins sticking out of it or rigids, there's all kinds of things, then you're seeing stuff that's developed here on this planet. These are our own space and technology developments in order to try to mime or catch up with their technology. Now, their technology is several thousand years ahead of us, so we got a while to go. But so when you see these crafts, and then I go on into my professional career, and I've flown all over the planet and across the North Pole and everywhere else that I can possibly think of, over 35 years in the industry, that I've seen several of these craft as well. One came out of the Brazilian jungle along the western ridge of the Andes Mountains, traveling south towards Buenos Aires along the route there. Another one's swinging across the front of the moon up north towards Gander and central Greenland, and one coming out of the Pacific. So there are times where you can recognize them. And now I'm not going to say that you can just pull them out of your hat like a common occurrence, but occasionally you get to see something, and when you identify it, you know it for what it is, and so you go on. And once again, seeing the craft, that's only, I guess, an affirmation of what I already know. Even if I didn't see it, I wouldn't need that affirmation. I've had, fortunately, so much exposure that I don't suffer from any doubt factor. But but these days, about 60% of what people see is our own technology, drones and different type of development of craft that we are manipulating. Area 51 has long been reassigned to a completely different geographical area up in Alaska, and they just leave a small smattering of devices and evidence there, so that the people won't go there and say, "Oh, we didn't see anything. They must have moved it, so let's look." So they leave a little bit going on, so people are satisfied, and they sit up there on the ridge and go ooh and ah, and one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, which is typical developments here on this planet. And
Keep
so
captive.
that's it. And then after that 60%, maybe about 15% is misidentification for atmospheric condition, lenticular clouds or standing lenticulars, and atmospheric conditions that people are just not simply aware of. There's a certain ignorant factor. I guess that's a strong word, but I can't think of anything that's naivety is probably a better word involved. And so when we finally get down to it, about 12% or so is the real thing. That you can see these crafts that come from space and skip along the upper atmosphere, and sometimes they come into it, and sometimes they land, but they are shifting their focus to areas of the world that are a little bit more receptive. This country is not receptive at all, and we have managed to poison and influence a great deal of the world against this issue because we hold the purse strings. If you don't do what we say, then you don't get this and this and this. And so, for a while, Russia was much more open and had open landing sites. And we talked to several scientists about the situation there in the late 80s after things opened up. And of course, we're not the only inhabited planet in the cosmos. There's a whole hell of a lot of other planets and people and situations, both advanced and not advanced. We are simply one step on the ladder that goes both directions into infinity. And so there is plenty else to do, and we don't deserve all their attention. We're smart enough to fix our own problems. God knows we're good at creating them.
Glenn, as far as the sightings that people talk about and see around like the International Space Station, do you think a lot of that is our own stuff that they're seeing that people just aren't aware of, but we have? Would that make more sense to have those ships right outside the station, close to the Earth?
Well, I think a part of it, we have to understand that when you travel on the magnetic lanes of space, you're going into proximity of the generating body. So, for instance, picture it this way. You drop a pebble into a pond and you can see the waves oscillating away from the drop zone. Okay, now you take another pebble and drop it a little further away, and those waves oscillating away from the drop zone. And where the two waves meet, you have a neutral zone. So you're using the wave of force. It's a frequency, because it's frequency. You're using a frequency of that wave and outbound until you intercept the next series of waves, and then you can travel on those as well. So there's a certain amount of proximity that's involved traveling along these lines. It doesn't have to be directly A to B, but there's proximity. And so we see some of these ships that are traveling through space and going to different places that are flying by in proximity. Now, the ISO, the International Space Station, is of course a grand position to be able to see stuff that's coming and stuff that's flying by and stuff that's flying into the atmosphere. Because of the changes in the solar system, these crafts and these people are monitoring each planet because they are trying to determine which is the weakest, and that will determine. We cannot yank or destroy one planet out of a system and expect the rest of the system to stay the same. All the orbits are principally aligned and balanced. And if, let's say, you destroy the Earth, then you destroy the rest of the planets in the solar system as well. That comes secondary as a domino effect. And so they're looking to see which planets are at the weakest stage so they can determine their next course of action. And for the last 50 years, they've been moving their populations off their planets. And to my knowledge, through contacts, they're about halfway done. And the next solar system that is the replacement of this one is Alpha Centauri. And so, because whenever one is preparing to go, another one is preparing to replace it. That is the balance of nature. So when this system breaks down and the sun goes and becomes a black hole in which you do not travel through, that is another science fiction misnomer, because everything that goes through the black hole is demagnetized. It's all demagnetized. And so all the molecules and atoms are demagnetized, recharged, and come out the other end in a recharged condition in order to start the process of reconstructing another solar system. And so in Alpha Centauri, that is the replacement. And they are moving their populations there. And from what I understand, several 100,000 volunteers from this world have gone there as well. No one is abducted. That's fantasy.
That's quite a commitment.
I was going to ask that
quite
question. It was what you thought of abduction and like implants and all that kind of stuff.
Well, like
you think
I
that's
said
all
before,
just made up to support?
I think it's part of the program in order to support that. And that doesn't mean that people aren't swearing to their particular circumstance, but I think that we are way too easily manipulated through hypnosis and through thought beam projection and through implantation of thought, not devices. And so it's very easy to make people believe something's happened to them that never did occur. And so I think we're using this. There's a copycat factor. I think as Carl Sagan said, if we were to take on face value the so-called claims of abductions, that would be several 100 million people. And obviously that's not happening. And so we have to understand that we are suffering from tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of mind and mental disorders and insecurities and schizophrenia and all kinds of different. I mean, you can't turn around without coming with a new acronym, OCD and this and this and this and this. A new one pops out every week, and so they all become excuses for our behavior, because we are not willing to take responsibility for our own minds and our own lives and to discipline them in order to maintain a clarity of thought. And so I came across one of these cases here locally at one of the UFO organizations, and this person, just ranted and raved. And you could see that this was a clear psychological condition of victimization. Whereas everything happens to this person, and they have no control, and it's just got to be somebody else nasty. And the easiest ones to blame are the aliens, because you can't come up with the proof of it. It has just become a replicated situation. And so I think that if you look at recently, when we released the book Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2, I added about 60 pages into there, and there was one section in here where they dealt with psychologist Susan Clancy in a book which is called Abducted: How People Come to Believe They Were Kidnapped by Aliens. Notes there were virtually no abduction narratives prior to 1962, and that is before alien invasions movies on television and through the media started to become used. And so there's a contrived, well-planned agenda to misdirect the UFO subject into entirely non-related tangents. And so I think that if we look professionally, and we have a section on our website, the validity of abductions, and one is written by a clinical therapist and also a military officer and what have you, and it deals with the birth experience, that we retain subconsciously the experience of birth, of which you're going through a tunnel or channel into a bright light, and then somebody slaps you on the behind a few times and you record some pain and there you go. And so there are so many aspects of the mind that we do not understand or wish to comprehend, and that we just, every single little affliction, problem, or whatever, negativity, has to be the aliens. And so, for instance, I was on a show recently where one of the speakers prior had claimed that she was the abductee of reptilians and they were impregnating her, but before any proof could be gathered, they would come back and remove the specimens. I mean, this stuff just
I've heard that too.
It's become so ludicrous that it's not even funny. First of all, it shows you how ignorant we are on the natural principles of nature. Cross-species insemination doesn't work. You cannot breed a cow with a rabbit or an elephant with a mouse. It does not take. It may be
I did
funny,
wonder
but
how that was possible.
It doesn't take because the natural DNA and the natural genetic selection, the molecules don't combine. And so, but we think that if you go out into space, every ridiculous concept now suddenly becomes validity because our imagination wishes it to be so. And that is not the case. True. And that is why I fight tenaciously on this and this subject, because while I can agree after half a century of exposure that there is certainly a certain amount of negativity coming from our establishment, the negativity and the misinformation from within the UFO community has risen to catastrophic position, where anything and everything goes, and it is a terrible thing to see because there's no truth, and nothing can be settled without truth. Would you not really want to know how something actually is, versus just letting your imagination run all the time and having no knowledge whatsoever? You receive no closure.
Of course you would.
And when you receive no closure, you can never go on to the next level of understanding or advancement. You are constantly dragged backwards. And that is the agenda on this planet.
Yeah, we're our own worst enemy almost as far as all that stuff goes. We're unwilling to believe in fact in front of you in science. We're more willing to make up something as an excuse for something we don't understand or don't want to understand.
I give you an example. We have positively learned in the last 50 years. The moon has atmosphere. It has pressure gradient. It has wind because of that. There are reports of photographs and reports of clouds and mists. We have water. We have water geysers. We have seismic activity. And we have a gravity of about 64% that of Earth, not 1/6. These are facts. And yet, the UFO community would rather run around and claim that all the moon missions are fake because we saw the flag wave, and obviously it can't wave in a vacuum.
Oh, the fake moon landing thing. Oh, yeah.
That's right, because they either can't do just basic research, they're incompetent, because as soon as they find out that there is much more to the moon situation, they will realize that they have explanations for why the flag waves or why the dust settles behind the lunar rover. It has nothing to do with a fake studio. It has to do with the actual conditions on the moon. And then the same people say, oh, well, the Saturn V launched and it went to the moon, but it really didn't go. But yet the telescopes tracked it. And Mount Palomar 200-inch took pictures of the Sea of Tranquility with the equipment sitting in the bottom. Well, we don't want to accept any of that. We'd rather go ahead and just play fantasy land, right? But look at the destruction Look at the destruction these people do. They influence a whole generation of internet-only youngsters that, well, why not? Blah, 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 blah. And we
witnessed it. Back in '69, we were kids. We were kids. It was such a big, it was such a big event.
Absolutely. There were thousands there at Cape Canaveral. It was live for millions on television.
Oh, yeah. They hard work.
telescopes from around the planet, professional and amateurs, tracked Apollo to the moon. Yet some bozo comes up and who knows nothing about Van Allen radiation belts and says, "Oh well, there's Van Allen radiation belts, so that kept the astronauts from going." Well, look it up. It's only charged particles. You have charged particles surrounding you on the surface of the world all the time, and it doesn't prevent you from moving around. Where do the people come up with this garbage?
Well, that's like the flat earthers. I mean, where did they come up with that? So, you know.
Well, that's it. You really. That's right.
That one, I don't even want to go into that one. Yeah.
Well, because then the excuse comes up, like with the abductions. Well, if there's so many reported of them, they must be true. Well, of course, I'm going to show the world believed the Earth was flat at one time, and it wasn't true either. You know, so you can use that kind of logic in forward or reverse, depending. But like I said, you know, and then look at the chemtrails. I mean, I'm flying airplanes for 40-some years. And I can tell you from the dozens of makes and models I've flown, there isn't a single extra tank on any of them, because the whole concept of flying has to do with weight. And the weight determines the altitude, which determines the fuel burn, which determines the economy of the flights, you know. And so these people look up and they see these trails, and they're contrails that comes from the engine exhaust. And the difference from the old airplanes and the new airplanes are the engines. We used to have turbojet engines. Now we have turbofan engines. We have a greater flow of airflow around the burner can of the engine, which mixes with the 800 degrees coming out and the crystal moisture molecules in the air and extends the contrails. And I had one woman on the show tell me, well, I could see the logo on the airplane. And I said, let me get this straight. Something that's 6 miles away, moving at 500 miles an hour, and you can see that? Give me a break. And I tried to explain to them that there are points in the sky, GPS coordinate points, that mark the center of the airway. Think of it as a freeway overpass. All the freeways are coming towards this overpass where they all meet, and then they go different directions. Well, these points are designated in the sky. That's why we have our highways in the sky. So airplanes are going to this point, traveling from this point at many different altitudes in all different directions. So they're converging at a point, and that's why you see them there. But they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. And then one person said, well, I saw tanks inside a picture of tanks inside of an airplane. I said, yeah, that's called firefighting equipment. Have you ever noticed that they show you the inside of the airplane, but not a picture of the outside? Because then you could see for itself that it says firefighting. Once again, the abuse of ignorance in order to establish a thought pattern that somebody's spraying all this stuff on top of you so that you now will become a mutant. And you think to yourself, something that moves at 500 miles an hour at 35,000 feet with the wind velocities at the different altitudes below it going different directions at many hundreds of miles an hour, what in the world could you spray that's ever going to reach the surface? Nothing.
Well, I could tell you this much, Glenn. If I were at a UFO conference and I thought about that, and you explained that to me, you would keep me real quiet. I hope you convince them. I hope you convince them.
I don't have to convince them. First of all, I don't care what they think whatsoever. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I know what the heck I'm talking about. And secondly, I'm not here to convince anybody. If you want to believe that somebody's creeping up in the middle of the night and taking you somewhere and you know, doing something stupid to you, and if that's what you have to grasp onto, then you can have it. And I'm not going to change your mind. And to tell you the truth, I could care less about change. I could care less, to tell you the truth.
What's wrong with good old-fashioned common sense?
Oh, I'm sorry. I know this is a serious conversation, but I needed a good laugh.
Well, that's good, you know. I don't go to that many conferences in the States. I go mostly to ones overseas that I've been invited to. I've done, in the last 2 years, probably 3 or 4. I was in Sweden, Denmark, Italy, and then back to Italy twice. And this country, they are not too happy inviting me anywhere because they know that I'm not going to twist and support stuff that is said, and I'm very straightforward and forthright, and they know that if I talk, then the rest of their people who paid so much money to go listen to a whole bunch of other stuff are going to start questioning why they got fleeced so badly.
What are the differences between the conferences here and the conferences in Europe that makes you prefer the European conferences?
Well, it's not necessarily a preference. It just is there. The people are much more open, open in a way that they are open to some rational thinking and logical thought. When you talk to them in this manner, you can see a response from them. They look at it and they say, yeah, my circumstances or experience match that, or that makes sense, and it's worth looking further into. Unfortunately, in this country, it's so polarized, with all of them trying to hang on to their particular frame of thought. And more importantly, they all mime each other. Every so often, if I'm bored, I'll watch a certain program or so that's on television, and basically they all agree to each other. They all say, well, and ancient astronaut theorists agree. Well, of course they're going to agree, because first of all, they don't want to get kicked off the program. Secondly, they don't want to be ostracized by the other people that they work with, right? And so they'll agree to anything. And the bottom line is because they don't know anything. And so you have to, and then you
don't know anything.
You don't know anything. So it's all theory. And so, one host stands up and says, well, this could have been this, if this would have been that, if it should have been this, but who the heck knows? But I just planted a whole bunch of thoughts in your brain, so you can be just as confused as I am. So if they had to do a show based upon what they actually know, they couldn't fill one season.
They should ask you.
Exactly.
I submitted all the books and paperwork to them, and they never responded. I also submitted by request all the books and paperwork to a number of their show people, and I'm not going to name names, and none of them responded. They want absolutely nothing to do with George Adamski, because Adamski provided answers, and that's the last thing they want to have, because you can't perpetuate mystery if you have answers that finally put that to rest.
Not that this is in the same realm, but I'm just thinking, I liken this to the paranormal community in the fact that when they make television shows, unless you're looking for the demons, the devil, the worst creatures imaginable, it's not considered in paranormal left to be on television. And it kind of reminds me that the people who are in the paranormal field for real are into the science. They want to do the experiments. They want to do that stuff. Meanwhile, television wants to show demons. So they're not interested in anything unless it's a demon or a monster.
Well, that's true.
Reminds me of that.
And it kind of bothers me, because I used to watch the Travel Channel, and you could go all over the world with programs and cooking shows and things like this. And now the Travel Channel only is the Paranormal Channel, which has all the same things. It. Now, but call it for what it is and don't false advertise it. And the same thing applies if you want to go look at the energy signatures and look into the paranormal area, then stay true to the subject. It has nothing to do with UFOs. And so don't drag it in there to try to credit a larger audience. Simply state it for what it is and the science behind it. And there's plenty of science. That the body gives off energy, and Kirlian photography, so does all other sentient beings, plants and people and animals. It gives off energy. That energy permeates into an establishment. And especially after something violent has happened, that energy flare is magnified almost by square root. And so it saturates it saturates into the walls of the establishment of where it happened. And so that energy then can be revisited. It has nothing to do with that person. It has to do with the energy impacted into the cells and molecules of the establishment. Make it for what it is, and not make it to be something else.
Yeah, most of the shows on TV won't do that because it's not as exciting for them. So they can't hypothesize and create new variations.
That's exactly true. And then so we then create an entire subject upon which there is nothing but mysticism and, once again, fear. Oh boy, I saw something move and now I have a chill down my spine and I want to, run to the bathroom. And then everybody's sitting there, but we have a psychosis of that. Think of all the people that go to see all the gruesome horror movies and chop up and disfigurement and the gore, and they just love it. And then they wonder why they can't sleep for 3 days, because the thought has been implanted subliminally into their thinking.
Yep.
I don't watch any of that stuff. I'm not going to put garbage into myself and expect to come up with enlightenment. That's just not going to happen.
Well, that's how I felt about some of the real violent ones too. I mean, some of the older Gothic ones I don't mind so much, but the violent ones, people say, "Oh, I watch it as an escape." I thought, that's your escape? Okay.
yeah, that's exactly.
Well,
that's a odd escape.
There are other ways to escape, frankly.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is.
If gruesome gore is your escape, and then we wonder why the replications of these type of horrific replications are going into our system, whether it's home abuse, spousal abuse, children abuse. Well, hell, we planted the thought.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And remember that there's an old saying that says, "As a man thinketh, so is he," and that is true. You are the personification of the thought that you hold.
You make me think of a recent movie that there's a movie that just came out. I think it's called The Hunt. It's about rich people who pay heavy amounts to hunt down poor people in certain scenarios and like areas. And I remember when the preview came out, I thought, God, this is the kind of sick stuff that we come up with. And then it turns around somewhere and ends up happening because so many people are fed into this.
That's right. We plant the thought and then wonder why the thought is replicated. Well, it's not rocket science. Once again, it's simple psychology. It's 101.
Yeah.
And you wonder, why people wonder why media is so influential, and they say, "Oh, it's just a movie." No, media can very much influence society in a way.
If you look at the publications, Hollywood versus what's it called, The Aliens and Silver Screen Flying Saucer, you will find that there is proof positive that the intelligence community maintains an office across the street from the major Hollywood studios. And ever since the late mid-1950s, all science fiction scripts have to be approved by them. So consequently, this tells you that there is a concentrated agenda in order to scare the living daylights out of people, to prevent them to think of alien contact as anything beneficial. Therefore, they have no desire for interaction, and that brings about no change. And that is the final outcome. We do not want any unsupervised or unapproved change to the enlightenment of the population of this world.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think about like Steven Spielberg in the 70s with Close Encounters, how it took a different approach, a more benevolent interaction, as opposed to obviously Independence Day or something like that. He actually took the approach more based on reality, like beings that come to our planet, they make some sort of contact. It isn't violent, it isn't, destructive. And then suddenly that kind of way of thinking just sort of dropped. Like he went on to make
Well, that's
E.T.,
right.
which is still sort of that, and then it just stopped.
Well, that's true because everything is run by money. In fact, I used to fly him around a little bit in my past corporate lives, and I actually sent them one of our books as well to his studio and never received any answer. I could have just personally presented it to him, but I didn't wish to impose myself on that particular clientele. But the idea is absolutely true. Now you've got War of the Worlds produced by him,
Yeah.
and all
Oh,
the other
yeah.
things, which is basically a remake of the same old propaganda, and that's because it's all economic driven. So if they can make well, first of all, it's three things: psychologically satisfying to that particular crowd, right? Whether it's the movie Alien or Terminator and any of this stuff. And secondly, market driven for the most sales as possible. And third, then eventually is the entire psychological impact of all of that. And so that's what we have. But we have two great controlling factors. One, it's an off switch. And two,
Yep.
don't go see it and they don't make any money and then they don't get any traction.
Exactly. If you don't support it, it won't come back.
It's called choices.
All about money.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've
That's
heard
it.
people say to me, "I'm surprised you haven't seen that movie, Verna." And they're naming some of these movies you guys are talking about, and I'm just like, they don't appeal to me. They just don't.
Well, I mean,
Well,
it doesn't
once
say
again,
some of them aren't entertaining. It's just that's what they are. They're entertaining.
They're
well, yeah,
entertaining.
but unfortunately, but look at how many people walk away from entertainment in substitution for reality. And that's a good thing to
Yeah.
mention right now. The entire science fiction realm has become a substitute for science fact. In other words, there were no talks about Stargates until the movie Stargate came out. Then everybody and their
That's
mother
true.
discovered a Stargate somewhere inside the pyramid or somewhere else or whatever. And
That's
so
true.
it's copied and replicated. The same thing for
Yeah.
time travel. That time travel comes from a media-induced promotional. It has nothing to do with anything else. And that people would actually think that you can go back or forward in time in order to revisit or visit something that hasn't happened or has happened, doesn't understand at all how nature
We have so
works.
We have so many YouTube time travelers these days, though.
That's right. And where's
they
their
never can get a
proof?
clear photo.
Never can get a
Yeah,
clear
never a
photo.
clear
They
photo.
never can bring back anything from that time that can be authenticated.
Yeah.
It's all fantasy. And so science fiction, some of it you can say, okay, entertaining. You say, well, Star Trek and Star Wars. But remember, there are underlying injections there. How many people believe that when you go into space, you have the same environment as a Star Wars barroom scene where all the aliens are looking like every single creature you could come up with? I mean, this has implanted itself into the younger generation. I talk to my younger nieces and nephews. Oh yeah, we believe in life in space, but they all think it looks like Star Wars. And so,
it's funny when you said that. I never
Interesting.
really
I read
thought
the
about
Star
that
Wars book, the
concept.
first one, and it's not a bad
But I mean,
book
just the
because I was a
concept,
bored
just the
teenager when I
concept
read
of
it.
all those alien
yeah.
creatures look that way because of their own environments, their own atmospheres that they live in, that's why they look like they do. But you're right, they're all in one room together, but that doesn't make any
Right.
sense.
Well,
It
first of
doesn't,
all,
but I knew it was fiction back then, and science had to back it up if they were going to do anything. If anything was going to come years later, where people know more. I mean,
well, remember the movie Avatar? There were people running around dressed up like those characters, believing they were in a makeshift world. How many people are running around speaking some composed version of Klingon that doesn't even exist? But it also tells you one thing too, as you mentioned, Tony. The environment is going to come together regardless of where you are. So in other words, the principles of the solidification of a solar system, of its planets, of how the planets come together, how they are seeded from space, how they go through the cooling process and the evolution of life comes about, is the same of regardless of where you go. You do not see lobsters crawling out of the ocean and start building microchips and spaceships. That's absolute nonsense. It's nonsense, right?
Yeah.
Because that
Yes.
doesn't exist. That the intelligent
doesn't, yeah.
factor is restricted to the phylum upon which it is incorporated. The whale might be the smartest animal in the ocean, but he ain't crawling up on land and start building microchips and spaceships. And so we have to understand that when we look at the Star Wars bar scene and we see all these creatures, that is imagination only, because that is not how life constructs. And we have such a resistance to understanding life as its basic principles. And when you look at some of the most enlightened scientists on this world, they're natural scientists, not the theoretical scientists, the astrophysicists who can only think about what happens on the other side of the universe because they don't have a damn clue. The natural scientists who deal with life in the ocean or in the atmosphere or what have you, or how the trees are coming about and what brings about all this process. They're the ones who reach some level of maturity. And so what we like to think that, these other planets are living under this particular pressure and circumstances, so now the lobster has to crawl out. That's not how it works, and it never has worked that way. Yeah. It's the same thing on this world. You can talk about the missing link until you're blue in the face, but the bottom line is there are no monkeys coming out of the jungle that are now humans. Right? So if the process was true, then you would still have that evolutionary factor, wouldn't you?
Yes.
So, and it's not true. And that's the basis part of it. One chromosome may as well be a million chromosomes. It doesn't make any difference. It's not the same species, and they do not evolve into something totally else. And we just simply refuse to even think about that. It's much easier just to think about the science fiction part.
Yeah. Yep. And that's what feeds in. And once they delve into the science fiction theories, and that regurgitates back to their fact, and then they regurgitate that back into their science fiction again.
Well, think about this. There's a knock on the door, and there stands a crayfish and says, "I'm from outer space." People say, okay. There's a knock on the door, and a normal human being stands in front of you and smiles and says, "I'm from outer space," and we say, "Oh, that's nonsense." I mean, talk about backwards. Talk about backwards. That's how we've been now programmed to think. So, until we challenge this, then we will remain in the state of confusion and worsening confusion that we already see. And I see this worsening confusion because we want to embrace that which we have no idea.
But Glenn, society though, and people and culture are going to evolve eventually. And eventually they're going to be able to sift the truth from the science fiction, because humanity has to evolve somehow. I mean, we're going to evolve. Think about what we think now compared to what we thought a couple hundred years ago about stuff like this.
Well, it depends on where you are.
It's eventually going to sort itself out.
Well, here's a couple thoughts for you. First of all, we do not go in a progressive continuum as a society. Our societies regularly rise and fall after 300-400 years. Well, several of the exceptions were the Egyptian societies and the Greeks and the Atlanteans and Lemurians, but on a whole, our societies go through a 300-400 year cycle, and then the process is broken to restart again. So you cannot expect to come to a level of understanding because you never reach it. We tear it down before we get to any point where we can accumulate enough to keep going, right? And on the second part of it, you have the resistance factor that does not want to accept anything other than their traditions or religious points of view, or so on and so forth. And so, because they, once again, don't understand. To a great extent, to use an example, the Catholic Church has been a hindrance. And yet, only recently, in the last 30 years, have they come to acknowledge the concept of extraterrestrial life and intelligence, only supporting their concept of a divine creator instead of negating it. And so you are standing on thousands of years of traditions, and as George used to say, traditions are the destroyer of the soul, because you're doing things because somebody else did it, God only knows when, and you don't even question it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Who are
That's
you?
exactly
Well,
When you ask,
but then you
when the
look at
question is, when the question is asked, who are you? Most people will say, I'm German, I'm Native American, I'm black, I'm Italian, I'm this, I'm that. And you're none of those things. That's not who you are. And whether they ran around with lederhosens or G-strings or anything else, that is not who you are either. Who are you? And that means, who is the soul that resides in your form? That soul which will go to the next form when this form passes away. You're not floating around in nirvana. You ain't visiting grandmother. You're going straight into the next body in order to express. That alone is more than most people can grasp as in itself.
But the old
because
myths,
they don't.
the old mythology that people that have remained in people's cultures and minds for so many years grasp some of that. They grasp a fraction of that, and a lot of them are keys to what you're talking about.
Some of them may, but I can only tell you from my travels around the world and exposures to people on this planet that they are not in the process of grasping a whole lot more. They go through cycles, and usually as they get towards middle age and older, they fall back upon preconceived notions and preconceived ideas because they want to have a certain stability of thought and support from the infrastructure and the other people and the neighbors and relatives around you. I mean, I can only speak of my family. My father and mother concurred 100%. My mother's mother, my grandmother also. Yet on my father's side, it was total disassociation and total denial. They didn't want to know anything of what he thought. And in fact, I remember my father's grandfather called him a communist because of what he thought. Right? And you know what my father thought? My father said, hell with you. I could care less what you think. I am going to go about what I need to go about, and I don't need your support or your concurrence at all. And so so they were their own individuals, and they didn't rely upon what other people's agreement in order to make them whole. And you don't find many of those these days, that's for sure.
You don't.
Not at all.
You definitely don't. No.
So unfortunately,
that's why I'm glad we have shows like this.
Right. Unfortunately, traditions can be very restrictive, and they can be very holding you back, because it holds you back into sometimes ancient beliefs weren't all that good either. Some of them could be okay. But remember that organized religions have taken the ancient beliefs and they have bastardized them into organized beliefs that can be wielded by church or by church officials in order to control the masses. If you think about what Jesus taught, and that was probably about half a dozen principles, and what the church is actually practicing, they're not even in the same ballpark, right? So that doesn't mean you don't have that doesn't mean you don't have reverence for whether it's Jesus or Buddha or Moses or any of these other people, the sages that came along. But what happens is you have to understand the fallibilities of mankind and how they wish to use things for their own self-benefit, and how they are then willing to compromise these principles and these actions in order to get the security, wealth, and comfort they want. They live in a marble bastion surrounded by gilded gold with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of income. You tell me Christ taught that when he went through the moneylenders in the temple? Of course not.
Exactly.
And so
there's
there
a
is
lot
a
of
huge...
lot of manipulative propaganda over the years with organized religions and that aspect.
I don't need to wear a skirt and a funny hat and wave candle incense to have reverence for God. That's for sure.
I'd like to see that. No, I'm just kidding.
All right,
maybe
come
Halloween,
on over.
Come
on over.
We'll pull it out.
Let's go over to Palo. If you still live in that same area, that same desert area, that would be fun. Watch you dancing around.
No, I have lived in San Diego County for the last 45 years, so the desert's a little bit too arid for me. I like green.
I don't blame
San Diego's
you.
perfect
I like
for
green
that.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, Glenn,
all right, guys,
there's so much more we could cover. Yeah, it's great. I'm sure when you come on again, we'll have more questions for you. We definitely have not covered all of this for sure.
Oh no, there's so much more to speak on, and I'm more than happy to come on whenever you have the opportunity, and to try to at least represent a different avenue of thought that may help people.
Yeah.
Or at least help the few people who wish to think about this in different terms. And
they're definitely out there.
Yeah, they're definitely out there, and we hope we can reach who we can. So they can always look at the website and send me an email, and will do the best I can to answer what I get.
Go ahead and give out your website for those first-time listeners who haven't heard you in the past.
It's Adamski Foundation, one word, .com. And you will find it's an older website, but like I said, I'm not in this for entertainment. I'm here to inform the public. So you can go through there. You'll find a plethora of information and some of the materials that we make available. Also, some people over time, and I had nothing to do with this, have placed some of my YouTube interviews or some of my interviews on YouTube. And so if you type in my name into YouTube, you will find some things there to listen to as well. So I think that gives the people a good idea on what I represent. And like I said, I'm not in the attack mode. I'm in a period of my life, and I'm working on my new book right now since we're all under quarantine, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that has forced me to discipline myself to continue on my new book, and I hope to get that out here within the year, at the end of the year, and it's called Can Truth Prevail? And it's my family's experiences and history in the UFO field, and many other things. And so there will be a bunch of people that will be very unhappy. But once again, I'm not here to do that. And so, I'm trying to think about how much time I have left and what I'm trying to represent and what I'm trying to put forth to give people at least something to look at that might make some sense.
Good. You'll have to come back on when it's published and see, and we'll promote it for you.
Okay. Yep. Sounds like a plan.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for being on, Glenn.
Well, thank you both. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and interact. And so next time in the Bay Area, I'll let you know.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
We'll have to have dinner again.
Look forward to it.
Okay.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. Talk to you later, Glenn.
Okay. Take care.
Enjoy the rest
Thank
of your
you.
Sunday.
Bye-bye. You too. Bye-bye. Bye.
Well, that was a great conversation. There's a lot of things that we talked about, that he talked about, that I just, I never thought about it in a different way. There's a lot of, just answer obviously induces more questions, I think. Definitely some answers, but there's so much we don't know that I think it's just amazing to talk about in general.
I always get some fresh new insight when I talk to Glenn. He he has such a clear insight on how things are in this field that it's a very unique insight that I don't hear from other people in the field. Not that they don't have unique insights, but his goes back such a long way that I always learn something new from him each conversation.
Yep, and it's very, very consistent. I mean, I hear other people talk about the field, but they're not always that consistent, and they don't really stick to the philosophies that came before what they're talking about. But Glenn and George Adamski in general really stick to their philosophies and their experiences and things that happen and are happening, I guess, is probably a better term.
And he also their philosophies and their theories of everything are plain common sense. They're just plain common sense, and they're backed up by science. Yeah.
I'll be curious to see what happens in the future, though.
Yeah, we could always have him back, and it's always good to have him on as a guest. He's somebody who I think would always have a fresh perspective on things.
Absolutely. All right, folks, that's the show for this week. And until next week, we're going to go ahead and sign off and say goodbye. Bye.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Ross Bugden.